Chapter 2. The next 3 days I was very busy. My table was placed in the front room of the new house. All my papers and books were arranged neatly. My clothes hung on a peg. The rest of the house was swept and cleaned. My mother arrived from the village with a sack full of vessels and helped to make up the house for me. She was stocking the store, room and the kitchen and spent most of her time traveling in a jutka to the market and coming back with something or other. She worked far into the night, arranging and rearranging the kitchen and the store.
At night she sat down with me on the veranda and talked of her house, keeping philosophy. I liked this veranda very much. We had a cool breeze. I felt immensely satisfied with my choice of the house now. I hoped my wife too would like it. But my mother, the moment she arrived from the village, said, "What an awful kitchen. So narrow. And the dining room would have been better if they had added at least a yard in length that side. We can't have everything our way in a house built by someone else." I became rather impatient if anyone criticized this house. She understood it and said, "I'm not saying it is a bad house." She had been used to our large, sprawling home in the village, and everything else seemed to her small and choking. I explained this fact to her and she agreed it was so, but do you know how hard it is to keep a huge house like ours clean? It takes me a whole lifetime to keep it tidy, but I don't grudge it.
Only I want a little more cooperation. Your father is becoming rather difficult nowadays. She explained how impatient he became when he heard the swish of a broom or the noise of scrubbing, and shouted at her to stop it all. As he was growing old, these noises got on his nerves. And so every time she wanted to clean the house, she had to wait till he went away to the fields. And do you know, when I delay this, how many other things get out of routine? Unless I have cleaned the house, I can't go and bathe. After bathing I have to worship, and only after that can I go near the cows. And if I fail to look at the cow, shed for half an hour, do you know what happens? She was completely wrapped up in her duties. House keeping was a grand affair for her. The essence of her existence consisted in the thrills and pangs and the satisfaction that she derived in running a well-ordered household.
She was unsparing and violent where she met slovenliness. If a woman can't take charge of a house and run it sensibly, she must be made to get into man's dress and go out in a procession. I thought of my wife and shuddered at the fate that might be awaiting her in the few weeks my mother was going to stay and help us run the house. My wife was the last daughter of the family and was greatly petted by her parents, in her own house, where she spent most of her time reading, knitting, embroidering or looking after a garden. In spite of it, after my marriage my mother kept her in the village and trained her up in house keeping. My wife had picked up many sensible points in cooking and household economy, and her own parents were tremendously impressed with her attainments when she next visited them. They were thrilled beyond words and remarked when I went there, "We are so happy, Sushila has such a fine house for her training."
Every girl on earth should be made to pass through your mother's hands, which, when I conveyed it to my mother, pleased her. She said, "I really do not mind doing it for everyone, but there are those who neither know nor learn when taught. I feel like kicking them when I come across that type." I knew she was referring to her eldest daughter-in-law, my brother's wife, whom she detested heartily. I had half a suspicion that my eldest brother went away to seek his livelihood in Hyderabad solely for this reason, for there used to be very painful scenes at home while the first daughter-in-law was staying in our house, my mother's idiosyncrasy being what it was and the other being of a haughty disposition. She was the daughter of a retired High Court judge, and would never allow a remark or a look from my mother to pass unchallenged, and as a result, great strife existed in the household for a number of years. My mother used to declare when my elder brother was not present, "Whatever happens, even with a 10,000 rupee dowry, I shall never accept a girl from a High Court judge's family again."
It had always been my great anxiety that my wife should not share this fate. My mother seemed to feel that some reference of more immediate interest was due to me and said, "Sushila is a modest girl. She is not obstinate. I was grateful for that negative compliment. That was at the beginning of our married years. They had constant contact after that, and with every effort Sushila came out better burnished than before. And then came a point when my mother declared, Sushila has learnt how to conduct herself before guests. At this point they separated. Now they were meeting again, with Sushila having a home of her own to look after, and my mother ready to teach the obedient pupil her business. It was really this which I secretly dreaded. On the following Friday, I was pacing the little Malgudi railway station in great agitation. I had never known such suspense before. She was certain to arrive with a lot of luggage, and the little child. How was all this to be transferred from the train to the platform? And the child must not be hurt.
I made a mental note, must shout as soon as the train stops, be careful with the baby. This seemed to my fevered imagination the all-important thing to say on arrival, as otherwise I fancied the child's head was sure to be banged against the doorway. And how many infants were damaged and destroyed by careless mothers in the process of coming out of trains? Why couldn't they make these railway carriages of safer dimensions? It ought to be done in the interests of baby welfare in India. Mind the baby and the door. And then the luggage. Sushila was sure to bring with her a huge amount of luggage. She required 4 trunks for her saris alone. Women never understood the importance of traveling light. Why should they? As long as there were men to bear all the anxieties and bother and see them through their travails. It would teach them a lesson to be left to shift for themselves. Then they would know the value of economy in these matters. I wrung my hands in despair. How was she going to get out with the child and all that luggage? The train stopped for just 7 minutes. I would help her down first and then throw the things out, and if there were any boxes left over they would have to be lost with the train, that was all. No one could help it.
I turned to the gnarled blue, uniformed man behind me. He was known as number 5 and I had known him for several years now. Whatever had to be done on the railway platform was done with his help. I had offered him 3 times his usual wages to help me today. I turned to him and asked, "Can you manage even if there is too much luggage?" "Yes, master, no difficulty. The train stops for 7 minutes. He seemed to have a grand notion of 7 minutes, a miserable flash it seemed to me. We unload whole wagons within that time. I will tell the pointsman to stop it at the outer signal, if necessary," he added. It was a very strength-giving statement to me. I felt relieved. But I think I lost my head once again.
I believe, in this needless anxiety, I became slightly demented. Otherwise I would not have rushed at the station, master, the moment I set eyes on him. I saw him come out of his room and move down the platform to gaze on a far-off signal post. I ran behind him, panting, "Good morning, station master." He bestowed an official smile and moved off to the end of the platform and looked up. I felt I had a lot of doubts to clear on railway matters and asked inanely, "Looking at the signals?" "Yes," he replied, and took his eyes down, and turned to go back to his room. I asked, "Can't they arrange to stop this train a little longer here?" "What for? Isn't there enough trouble as it is?" I laughed sympathetically and said, "I said so because it may not be possible for passengers to unload all their trunks." "I should like to see a passenger who carries luggage that will take more than 6 minutes. I have been here 30 years. I said, "My wife is arriving today with the infant. I thought she would require a lot of time in order to get down carefully. And then she is bound to have numerous boxes. These women, you know," I said, laughing artificially, seeking his indulgence. He was a good man and laughed with me. "Well, sometimes it has happened that the train was held up for the convenience of a second-class passenger." "Are your people traveling second?" "I can't say," I said. I knew well she wouldn't travel second, although I implored her in every letter to do so. She wrote rather diplomatically, "Yes, don't be anxious, I and the baby will travel down quite safely." I even wrote to my father-in-law,
but that gentleman preserved a discreet silence on the matter.
I knew by temperament he disliked the extravagance of traveling second, although he could afford it and in other ways had proved himself no miser. I felt furious at the thought of him and told the station master, "Some people are born niggards, would put up with any trouble rather than..." But before I could finish my sentence, a bell rung inside the station office and the station master ran in, leaving me to face my travail and anguish alone. I turned and saw my porter standing away from me, borrowing a piece of tobacco from someone. "Here, number 5, don't get lost." A small crowd was gathering unobtrusively on the platform. I feared he might get lost at the critical moment. A bell sounded. People moved about. We heard the distant puffing and whistling. The engine appeared around the bend.
A whirling blur of faces went past me as the train shot in and stopped. People were clambering up and down. Number 5 followed me about, munching his tobacco casually. "Search on that side of the mail van." I hurried through the crowd, peering into the compartments. I saw my father-in-law struggling to get to the doorway. I ran up to his carriage. Through numerous people getting in and out, I saw her sitting serenely in her seat with the baby lying on her lap. "Only 3 minutes more," I cried. "Come out." My father-in-law got down. I and number 5 fought our way up, and in a moment I was beside my wife in the compartment. "No time to be sitting down. Give me the baby," I said. She merely smiled and said, "I will carry the baby down. You will get these boxes."
"That wicker box, bring it down yourself. It contains baby's bottle and milk vessels." She picked up the child and unconcernedly moved on. She hesitated for a second at the thick of the crowd and said, "Way please," and they made way for her. I cried, "Sushila, mind the door and baby." All the things I wanted to say on this occasion were muddled and gone out of mind. I looked at her apprehensively till she was safely down on the platform, helped by her father. Number 5 worked wonders within a split second.
I wouldn't have cared if the train had left now. The mother and child stood beside the trunks piled up on the platform. I gazed on my wife, fresh and beautiful, her hair shining, her dress without a wrinkle on it, and her face fresh, with not a sign of fatigue. She wore her usual indigo-colored silk sari. I looked at her and whispered, once again in this sari, still so fond of it, as my father-in-law went back to the compartment to give a final look round. "When will she wake up?" I asked, pointing at the child, whom I found enchanting, with her pink face and blue shirt.
"Father is coming down," she said, hinting that I had neglected him and ought to welcome him with a little more ceremony. I obeyed her instantly, went up to my father-in-law and said, "I am very happy, sir, you have come." He smiled and said, "Your wife and daughter got comfortable places, they slept well." "Did they? How? I thought there was such a crowd." My wife answered, "What if there are a lot of others in the compartment? Other people must also travel." I didn't mind it. I knew she was indirectly supporting her father, anticipating my attacks on him for traveling third. "I only thought you might find it difficult to put the child to sleep," I said. "Oh, everybody made way for us, and we got a whole berth to ourselves," she said, demanding of me by every look and breath that I should be sufficiently grateful to her for it. I turned to him and said, "I'm so happy you managed it so well, sir." He was pleased. He said, "People are ever so good when they see Sushila and the baby."
"I hope you will stop with us for at least a week," I said, and looked at my wife for approval. But her father declined the invitation with profuse thanks. He was to be back in his town next day and he was returning by the evening train. He said, there were 3 Bombay men. They liked Leela so much that they tried to give her a lot of biscuits. She was only too eager to accept, but I prevented. "Biscuits are bad for the baby," I said. We moved on. I stretched out my hand. "Let me carry her," I said. My wife declined. "You don't know how to carry a baby yet. You will sprain her." She clasped her closer and walked off the platform. A Victoria carriage waited for us outside. Our trunks were stuffed into it, and we squeezed ourselves in. I shared the narrow seat behind the driver with my father-in-law, leaving the other seat for mother and child. Between us were heaped all the trunks, and I caught patches of her face through the gaps in the trunks. She talked incessantly about the habits of the infant, inquired about the plan of our house, and asked the names of buildings and streets that we passed.
My mother came down and welcomed her at the gate. She had decorated the threshold with a festoon of green mango leaves and the floor and the doorway with white flower designs. She was standing at the doorway and as soon as we got down cried, "Let Sushila and the child stay where they are." She had a pan of vermilion solution ready at hand and circled it before the young mother and child, before allowing them to get down from the carriage. After that she held out her arms, and the baby vanished in her embrace. A look at my mother, her eagerness as she devoured them with her look, and led them into the house, and I was moved by the extraordinary tenderness which appeared in her face. All my dread of yesterday as to how she would prove as a mother-in-law was suddenly eased. My mother was swamped by this little daughter of mine. She found little time to talk or think of anything else. She fussed over the young mother and the child. She felt it her primary duty to keep the young mother happy and free to look after the little one. The child seemed to be their meeting point, and immediately established a great understanding and harmony between them.
All day my mother compelled my wife to stay in her own room and spent her entire time in the kitchen preparing food and drink for her and the child. When the child cried at nights, my mother, sleeping in the hall, sprang up and rocked the cradle, before the young mother should be disturbed. The child still drew nourishment from its mother, and so the latter needed all the attention she could get. My mother stayed with us the maximum time she could spare, 2 months, and then returned to the village. Tarankan, Tarankan, Tarankan.
I left the college usually at 4:30 p.m., the moment the last bell rang, and avoiding all interruptions reached home within about 20 minutes. As soon as I turned the street, I caught a glimpse of Sushila tinkering at her little garden in our compound, or watching our child as she toddled about picking pebbles and mud. It was not in my wife's nature to be demonstrative, but I knew she waited there for me. So I said, "I have taken only 20 minutes, and already you are out to look for me." She flushed when I said this, and covered it up with, "I didn't come out to look for you, but just to play with the child." My daughter came up and hugged my knees, and held up her hands for my books. I gave her the books. She went up the steps and put them on the table in my room. I followed her in. I took off my coat and shirt, picked up my towel and went to the bathroom, with the child on my arm, as she pointed at the various articles about the house and explained them to me in her own terms.
Most of her expressions were still monosyllables, but she made up a great deal by her vigorous gesticulations. She insisted upon watching me as I put my head under the tap. The sight of it thrilled her and she shrieked as water splashed about. I put her safely away from the spray as I bathed, but she stealthily came nearer step by step and tried to catch some of the drops between her fingers. "Child, keep off water." At this she pretended to move off, but the moment I shut my eyes under water and opened them again, she would have come nearer and drenched a corner of her dress, which was a signal for me to turn off the water and dry myself. I rubbed myself, lifted her on my arm, went to my room, and brushed my hair. I did this as a religious duty because I felt myself to be such a contrast to them when I returned in the evening, in my sagging grey cotton suit, with grimy face and ink-stained fingers, while the mother and daughter looked particularly radiant in the evenings, with their hair dressed and beflowered, faces elegantly powdered.
By the time I reached this stage, my wife came out and said, "Your coffee is getting cold. Won't you come in?" Yes, and we moved off to our little dining room. An alcove at the end of the dining room served for a shrine. There on a pedestal she kept a few silver images of gods, and covered them with flowers. 2 small lamps were lit before them every morning. I often saw her standing there with the light in her face, her eyes closed and her lips lightly moving. I was usually amused to see her this, and often asked what exactly it was that she repeated before her gods. She never answered this question. To this day I have never learnt what magical words she uttered there with closed eyes. Even when I mildly joked about it, oh, becoming a yogi, she never tried to defend herself, but merely treated my references with the utmost indifference. She seemed to have a deep secret life. There hung about this alcove a perpetual smell of burnt camphor and faded flowers.
I sat down on the plank facing the shrine, with the child on my lap. A little plate came up with some delicacy or tidbit heaped on it, my tiffin. Sushila placed this in front of me and waited to see my reaction. I looked up at her standing before me and asked, "What is this?" She replied, "Find out for yourself, let us see if you recognize it." As I gazed at it wondering what it might be, the child thrust her hand out for it. I put a little into her mouth while the mother protested, "You are going to spoil her giving her whatever she wants." "No, just a little."
"It will make her sick. She has been eating all sorts of things lately. Don't blame me if she gets sick." "Oh, she won't. Just a little won't do her any harm." As Leela held up her hands for more, her mother cried, "No, baby, it won't do. Don't trouble father. Come away, and the little one stuck to me fast, avoiding her mother's gaze, and I put my left arm about her and said, "Don't worry about her, I won't give her any more." As I finished what was on the plate, Sushila asked, "Do you want some more?" This was always a most embarrassing question for me. As I hesitated, she asked, "Why, is it not good?" "It is good," I groaned, but
smells rather smoky, doesn't it?" "But for the smell it would be perfect," she said. And I couldn't but agree with her. "I prepared such a large quantity thinking you would like it." She went in and brought out a little more and pushed it onto my plate, and I ate with relish just because she was so desperately eager to get me to appreciate her handiwork. She gave me coffee. We left the kitchen and sat down in the hall. The child went over to her box in a corner and rummaged its contents and threw them about and became quite absorbed in this activity. My wife sat in the doorway, leaning against the door and watching the street. We spent an hour or more, sitting there and gossiping. She listened eagerly to all the things I told her about my college, work and life. Though she hadn't met a single person who belonged to that world, she knew the names of most of my colleagues and the boys and all about them. She knew all about Brown and what pleased or displeased him.
she took sides with me in all my discussions and partisanships, and hated everyone I hated and respected anyone I respected. She told me a great deal about our neighbors, their hopes and fears, and promises and qualities. This talk went on till darkness crept in, and the lights had to be switched on. At the same time the clattering at the toy box ceased. This was a signal that the child would demand attention. She came towards us whimpering and uttering vague complaints. My wife got up and went in to light the oven and cook the dinner, while I took charge of Leela and tried to keep her engaged till her food was ready. On the first of every month, I came home with 10 rupee notes bulging in an envelope, my monthly salary, and placed it in her hand. She was my cash keeper. And what a ruthless accountant she seemed to be. In her hands, 100 rupees seemed to do the work of 200, and all through the month she was able to give me money when I asked.
When I handled my finances independently, after making a few routine savings and payments, I simply paid for whatever caught my eyes and paid off anyone who approached me, with the result that after the first 10 days, I went about without money. Now it was in the hands of someone who seemed to understand perfectly where every rupee was going or should go, and managed them with a determined hand. She kept the cash in a little lacquer box, locked it up in her almirah, and kept a minute account of it in the last pages of a diary, 4 years old. We sat down at my table to draw up the monthly budget and list of provisions. She tore off a sheet of notepaper, and wrote down a complete list from rice down to mustard. "I have written down the precise quantity, don't change anything as you did once." This was a reference to a slight change that I once attempted to make in her list.
She had written down 2 seers of Bengal gram, but the national provision stores could not supply that quantity, and so the shopman suggested he would give half of it, and to make up the purchase, he doubled the quantity of jaggery. All done with my permission. But when I returned home with these, she saw the alterations and was completely upset. I found that there was an autocratic strain in her nature in these matters, and unsuspected depths of rage. Why has he made this alteration? She had asked, her face going red. He didn't have enough of the other stuff, I replied, tired and fatigued by the shopping and on the point of irritability myself. If he hasn't got a simple thing like Bengal gram, what sort of a shop has he? Come and see it for yourself, if you like, I replied, going into my room. She muttered, why should it make you angry? I wonder. I lay down on my canvas chair, determined to ignore her, and took out a book. She came presently into my room with a paper screw full of sugar and said, this man has given underweight of sugar. He has cheated you. I lowered the book, frowned at her and asked, what do you mean?
I fear to speak to you if you get angry, she said. Who is angry? I asked. What is the matter, tell me? I wrote for 2 measures of sugar, and see this, he has billed for 2 measures and has actually given a measure and a half. I have measured it just now. She looked at me victoriously, waiting to hear how I was going to answer this charge. I merely said, he wouldn't do such a thing. You must have some extraordinary measure with you at home.
Nothing wrong with my measure. Even your mother measured everything with it and said it was correct. So this was a legacy from her mother-in-law. She had taught the girl even this. She had a bronze tumbler, which she always declared was a correct half measure, and she would never recognize other standards and measures. She insisted upon making all her purchases, ghee or oil or milk or salt, with the aid of this measure, and declared that all other measures, including the government-stamped ones, were incorrect, and were kept maliciously incorrect because some municipal members were businessmen. She used the same tumbler for weighing too, placing it for weight in the scale pan, declaring that the curious thing about the vessel was that by weight too it was exactly half seer, and she would challenge anyone to disprove it. All tradespeople somehow succumbed to this challenge and allowed her to have her own way. She carried this tumbler about wherever she went, and I now found that she had procured a similar one for her daughter-in-law, and had trained her in the use of it.
Throw away the tumbler and use an honest measure, I said. Sushila merely looked at me and said, please don't speak so loudly. The child is asleep, and tried to go out of the room. I called her back and said, if you use an honest measure you will find that others have also done so. This national provisions man is a thief, she cried, the sooner you change the better. This annoyed me very much. I had known the NPS man for years and liked him. I went all the way to South Extension to patronize his shop, and I liked the man because he was fat and talkative, and Sastri the logic man always said that it was the best shop in the town. I rather prided myself on going to the shop. I liked the fat, thoughtful proprietor. I said, there is nothing wrong with him. He is the best shopman known. I won't change him. I don't know why you should be so fond of him when he is giving under measure and rotten stuff, she replied. I was by this time very angry. Yes, I am fond of him because he is my second cousin, I said with a venomous grin.
Her hatred of him was not mitigated. She said, you would pay cart hire and go all the way to South Extension to be cheated by him rather than go to a nearer shop. And his rates. She finished the rest of her sentence with a shiver. I don't care if he overcharges, I won't drop him, I declared. Hush, remember the child is sleeping, she said and left the room. I lay in my chair fretting for 15 minutes and then tried to resume my study, but could read only for 5 minutes. I got up and went over to the store room as she was putting away the provisions and articles in their respective tin or glass containers. I stood at the doorway and watched her. I felt a great pity for her, the more because I had not shown very great patience. I asked, I will return the jaggery if it is too much. Have you absolutely no use for it? In answer, she pushed before me a glass goblet and said, this can hold just half a vis of jaggery and not more, which is more than enough for our monthly use. If it is kept in any other place, ants swarm on it. I now saw the logic of her indignation, and by the time our next shopping was done, she had induced me to change over to the co-operative stores.
Since then, every time the monthly list was drawn up, she warned me, don't alter anything in it. I followed her list with strict precision, always feeling that one could never be sure what mess any small change might entail. If there were alterations to be made, I rather erred on the side of omission and went again next day after taking her suggestion. She was very proud of her list. It was precise. Every quantity was conceived with the correct idea as to how long it should last. There were over 24 different articles to be indented, and she listed them with foresight and calculation. She was immensely proud of this ability. She gave me 20 rupees or more for these purchases. I went out to the co-operative stores in the market road and returned home 3 hours later, followed by a coolie carrying them all in paper bags and bundles, stuffed into a large basket. She always waited for them at the door with unconcealed enthusiasm.
The moment I was at the gate, she held out her hand for the bill, and hurriedly ran her eyes down the columns, checking the figures and prices. Oh, you have got all the things. And the cost didn't go up above 2280 total, slightly better than it was last month. Which item is cheaper this month? She was in raptures over it. I loved to see her so pleased, and handed her the change to the last pie. She paid the coolie 3 annas. She would never alter this figure whatever happened. If anyone had the hardihood to expect more, she declared, don't stand there and argue. Be off. Your master has offered you an anna more than you deserve. After all, the market is only half a mile away. She carried the packages to the store room and put each in its container, neatly labeled and ranged along a rack. She always needed my assistance to deal with rice. It was the bulkiest bag. It was my set duty on these days to drag the gunny sack along to the store, lift it and empty it into a zinc drum. I invited her displeasure if I didn't do it carefully. If any rice scattered accidentally on the floor, she said, I don't know when you will learn economic ways. You are so wasteful. On the quantity you throw about, another family could comfortably live.
She watched these containers as a sort of barometer, the level of their contents indicating the progress of the month. Each had to be at a particular level on a particular date, and on the last date of the month just enough for another day, when they would be replenished. She watched these with a keen eye, like a technician watching an all-important meter at a powerhouse. All went very well as long as she was reigning supreme in the kitchen, till my mother sent an old lady from the village to cook for us and assist us. One evening we were sitting as usual in the front veranda of the house when an old lady stood at our gate, with a small trunk under her arm, and asked, Is this teacher Krishnan's house?
Yes. Who are you? Come in. I opened the gate for her. She looked at me, wrinkling her eyes, and said, Kittu, I have seen you as a baby and a boy. How big you have grown. She came up to the veranda, peered closely into my wife's face and said, You are our daughter-in-law. I am an old friend of Camus, she said, referring to my mother by her maiden name. By this time Leela, who had been playing near her box, came out on hearing a new voice. At the sight of her, the old lady cried, So this is Camus's grandchild. She picked her up in her arms and fondled her. Susheila's heart melted at the sight of it, and she said, Come into the house, won't you? The old lady went in, sat under the lamp and took out of a corner of her sari a crumpled letter and gave it to me. It was from my mother. I am sending this letter with an old friend of mine, who was assisting me in household work when you were a baby.
She then went away to live with her son. He died last year, and she has absolutely no one to support her. She came to me a few weeks ago in search of work. But I have no need for assistance nowadays. Moreover, your father grows rather irritable if he sees any extra person in the house. So I have given her her bus fare and sent her on to you. I have always felt that Sushila needed an assistant in the house, the baby demanding all the attention she can give. My friend will cook and look after the child. And you can give her whatever salary you like. While the old lady kept fondling the child, sitting on the floor, I read the letter under the hall light and my wife read it over my shoulder. We looked at each other. There was consternation in her look. There were many questions which she was aching to ask me. I adjourned to my room and she followed me. What shall we do? She asked, looking desperate.
Why do you look so panicky? We will send her back if you do not want her. No. No. How can that be? Your mother has sent her. We have got to have her. I think it will be good to have her. All your time is now spent in the kitchen when you are not tending the baby. I don't like you to spend all your time cooking either tiffin or food.
But I like it. What is wrong in it? She asked. You must spend some more time reading or stitching or singing. Man or woman is not born merely to cook and eat, I said, and added, you have neglected your books. Have you finished Ivanhoe? She had been trying to get through Ivanhoe for years now, and Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare. But she never went beyond the 50th page. Her library also contained a book of hymns by a Tamil saint, a few select stanzas of Kamba Ramayana, Palgrave's Golden Treasury and a leather-bound Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit. I knew how fond she was of books. She was always planning how she was going to devour all the books and become the member of some library. But it never became more than an ambition.
In the earlier years of our married life, we often sat together with one or other of the books, in the single-top, floor room in her father's house, and tried to read. The first half an hour would be wasted because of an irresponsible mood coming over her, which made her laugh at everything. Even the most solemn poem would provoke her, especially such poems as were addressed by a lover. My true love hath my heart and I have his. She would laugh till she became red in the face. Why can't each keep his own or her own heart instead of this exchange? She then put out her hand and searched all my pockets, saying, in case you should take away mine. Hush, listen to the poem, I said, and she would listen to me with suppressed mirth and shake her head in disapproval. And then another line that amused her very much was, oh, mistress mine, where are you roaming? She would not allow me to progress a line beyond, saying, I shall die of this poem some day. What is the matter with the woman loafing all over the place except where her husband is?
However much she might understand or not understand, she derived a curious delight in turning over the pages of a book, and the great thing was that I should sit by her side and explain. While she read the Tamil classics and Sanskrit texts without my help, she liked English to be explained by me. If I showed the slightest hesitation, she would declare, perhaps you don't care to explain English unless you are paid 100 rupees a month for it? But all that stopped after the child was born. When the child left her alone, she had to be in the kitchen, and my argument now appealed to her. She said, but that will mean an extra expense. What shall we pay her? About 8 rupees, just what everyone pays, I think, I said.
Oh, too much, she said. I'm sure she will waste another 8 rupees worth of things. This is an unnecessary expense, she said. I explained, very necessary and we can afford it. In addition to the Provident Fund, why should we send 35 to the savings bank? I think about 25 rupees a month for the bank will be more than enough. Many of my friends do not save even 5 rupees. Why do you want to follow their example? We must live within our means and save enough. She often declared, when we are old we must never trouble others for help. And remember there is a daughter, for whose marriage we must save. When we bring forth some more daughters and sons, I began, and she covered my mouth with her fingers. You men, what do you care? You would think differently if God somehow made you share the bothers of bringing forth. Where is your promise? I often reiterated and confirmed our solemn pact that Leela should be our only child. And anything I said otherwise, even in jest, worried her very much.
With the future so much in mind, she planned all our finances. She kept a watch over every rupee as it arrived, and never let it depart lightly, and as far as possible tried to end its career in the savings bank. But now our savings were affected to the extent of at least 10 rupees, as she explained, 6 rupees, old lady's salary. Sushila stubbornly refused more than that for a year, and 4 rupees for all her waste, putting it at a minimum. She was disconsolate over it for a long time, till I appeased her by saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. When I get some money from examination papers, I will give you the whole of it for the savings bank." In course of time, we found that we simply couldn't do without the old lady. She cooked the food for us, tended the child, gave us the necessary courage when the child had fever or stomach ache and we became distraught. She knew a lot of tricks about children's health. She grew very fond of the child and took her out and kept her very happy.
She established herself as a benign elder at home, and for us it meant a great deal. Her devotion to the child enabled me to take my wife twice or thrice a month to a picture, on a walk along the river, or out shopping. My wife grew very fond of her and called her Granny, so did Leela. But Sushila had a price to pay for this pleasure. She lost her supremacy over the kitchen and the store. The levels in the containers at the store went down in other ways than my wife calculated. Sushila protested and fought against it for some time, but the old lady had her own way of brushing aside our objections. And Sushila adjusted her own outlook in the matter. Didn't I bargain for a waste of 4 rupees a month? Well, it is not so hard, because she wastes only 3 rupees. Our provision bill fluctuated by only 3 rupees, and it was a small price to pay for the great company and service of the old lady, who lived on 1 meal a day, just a handful of cooked rice and buttermilk. It was a wonder how she found the energy for so much activity. My wife often sat down with her in order to induce her to eat well, but it was of no avail. I sat in my room, at the table. It was Thursday and it was a light day for me at college, only 2 hours of work in the afternoon, and not much preparation for that either. Pride and Prejudice for a senior class, non-detailed study, which meant just reading it to the boys. And a composition class.
I sat at my table as usual after morning coffee, looking over the books ranged on the table and casually turning over the pages of some exercise books. Nothing to do. Why not write poetry? Ages since I wrote anything? My conscience had a habit of asserting itself once in 6 months and reminding me that I ought to write poetry. At such moments, I opened the bottommost drawer of my table and pulled out a notebook of about 500 pages, handsomely bound. I had spent nearly a week at a local press getting this done some years ago. Its smooth pages contained my most cherished thoughts on life and nature and humanity. In addition to shorter fragments that I wrote at various times on a miscellany of topics, it contained a long unfinished poem on an epic scale to which I added a few dozen lines whenever my conscience stirred in me.
I always fancied that I was born for a poetic career, and someday I hope to take the world by storm with the publication. Some of the pieces were written in English and some in Tamil. I hadn't yet made up my mind as to which language was to be enriched with my contributions to its literature, but the language was unimportant. The chief thing seemed to be the actual effort. I turned over the pages looking at my previous writing. The last entry was several months ago, on nature. I felt satisfied with it but felt acute discomfort on realizing that I had hardly done anything more than that. Today I was going to make up for all lost time. I took out my pen, dipped it in ink, and sat hesitating. Everything was ready except a subject. What should I write about?
My wife had come in and was stealthily watching the pages over my shoulder. As I sat biting the end of my pen, she remarked from behind me, "Oh, the poetry book is out. Why are you staring at a blank page?" Her interruption was always welcome. I put away my book and said, "Sit down," dragging a stool nearer. "No, I'm going away. Write your poetry. I won't disturb you." You may forget what you wanted to write. I have not even thought of what to write, I said. Someday I want to fill all the pages of this book and then it will be published and read all over the world. At this she turned over the leaves of the notebook briskly and laughed. There seem to be over 1,000 pages, and you have hardly filled the first 10. The trouble is I have not enough subjects to write on, I confessed. She drew herself up and asked, "Let me see if you can write about me."
A beautiful idea, I cried. Let me see you. I sat up very attentively and looked at her keenly and fixedly like an artist or a photographer viewing his subject. I said, "Just move a little to your left, please. Turn your head right. Look at me straight here. That's right. Now I can write about you. Don't drop your lovely eyelashes so much. You make me forget my task. Ah, now, don't grin please. Very good. Stay as you are and see how I write now. Steady." I drew up the notebook, ran the fountain, penned hurriedly over it and filled a whole page beginning. She was a phantom of delight.
When first she gleamed upon my sight. A lovely apparition, sent to be a moment's ornament.
I went on for 30 lines, ending. And yet a spirit still, and bright, with something of an angel, light.
I constantly paused to look at her while writing, and said, "Perfect. Thank you. Now listen." "Oh, how fast you write," she said admiringly. "You will also find how well I've written." "Now listen," I said, and read as if to my class, slowly and deliberately, pausing to explain now and then.
I never knew you could write so well. It is a pity that you should have underrated me so long, but now you know better. Keep it up, I said. And if possible don't look at the pages, say roughly between 150 and 200, in the Golden Treasury. Because someone called Wordsworth has written similar poems. This was an invitation for her to run in and fetch her copy of the Golden Treasury and turn over precisely the forbidden pages. She scoured every title and first line and at last pitched upon the original. She read it through, and said, "Aren't you ashamed to copy?"
"No," I replied. "Mine is entirely different." He had written about someone entirely different from my subject. "I wouldn't do such a thing as copying." "I should be ashamed to have your memory," I said. "You have had the copy of the Golden Treasury for years now, and yet you listen to my reading with gaping wonder. I wouldn't give you even 2 out of 100 if you were my student." At this point our conversation was interrupted by my old clock. It burst in upon us all of a sudden.
It purred and bleated and made so much noise that it threw us all into confusion. So Sheila picked it up and tried to stop it without success, till I snatched Tane and smothered it. "Now, why did it do it?" she demanded. I shook my head. "Just for pleasure," I replied. She gazed on its brown face and said, "It is not even showing the correct time. It is showing 2 o'clock, 4 hours ahead. Why do you keep it on your table?" I had no answer to give. I merely said, "It has been with me for years, poor darling. I will give it away this afternoon. A man comes to buy all old things."
No, take care, don't do it," I warned. She didn't answer, but merely looked at it and mumbled, "This is not the first time. When you are away it starts bleating after I have rocked the cradle for hours and made the child sleep, and I don't know how to stop it. It won't do for our house. It is a bother." That evening when I returned home from college, the first thing I noticed was that my room looked different. My table had lost its usual quality and looked tidy, with all books dusted and neatly arranged. It looked like a savage, suddenly appearing neatly trimmed and groomed. The usual corner with old newspapers and magazines piled up was clean swept. The pile was gone. So was the clock on the table. The table looked barren without it.
For years it had been there. With composition books still under my arm, I searched her out. I found her in the bathroom, washing the child's hands. "What have you done with my clock?" I asked. She looked up and asked in answer, How do you like your room? I have cleaned and tidied it up. What a lot of rubbish you gathered there. Hereafter on every Thursday. Answer first, where is the clock? I said. Please wait. I will finish the child's business first and then answer.
I stood at the bathroom doorway and grimly waited. She finished the child's business and came out bearing her on her arm. While passing me, she seized the child's hand and tapped me under the chin with it and passed on without a word to her room. She later met me in my room as I sat gloomily gazing at the table. Why have you not had your tiffin or wash? She asked, coming up behind and gently touching my shoulder. I don't want any tiffin, I snapped.
Why are you so angry? She asked. Who asked you to give away that clock? I asked. I didn't give it away. That man gave me 12 annas for it, a very high price indeed.
Now you are a... I began. I looked at the paper corner and wailed, you have given away those papers too. There were old answer papers there. Yes, I saw them, she said. They were 4 years old. Why do you want old papers? She asked. I was too angry to answer. You have no business to tamper with my things, I said. I don't want any tiffin or coffee. I picked up my coat, put it on and rushed out of the house, without answering her question, where are you going? I went straight back to the college. I had no definite plan. There was no one in the college. I peeped into the debating hall, hoping there might be somebody there. But the evening was free from all engagements. I remembered that I hadn't had my coffee. I walked about the empty corridors of the college. I saw the servant and asked him to open our common room.
I sent him to fetch me coffee and tiffin from the restaurant. I opened my locker and took out a few composition books. I sat correcting them till late at night. I heard the college clock strike 9. I then got up and retraced my way home. I went about my work with a business like air. I took off my coat, went at great speed to the bathroom and washed. I first took a peep into my wife's room. I saw her rocking the baby in the cradle. I went into the kitchen and asked the old lady, have the rest dined? The old lady answered, Sushila waited till 8:30. I was not interested in this. Her name enraged me. I snapped, all right, put up my leaf and serve me. I only wanted to know if the child had eaten. This was to clear any misconception anyone might entertain that I was interested in Sushila.
I ate in silence. I heard steps approaching and told myself, oh, she is coming. I trembled with anxiety, lest she should be going away elsewhere. I caught a glimpse of her as she came into the dining room. I bowed my head and went on with my dinner unconcerned, though fully aware that she was standing before me, dutifully as ever, to see that I was served correctly. She moved off to the kitchen, spoke some words to the old lady, and came out, and softly moved back to her own room. I felt angry. Doesn't even care to wait and see me served. She doesn't care. If she cared, would she sell my clock? I must teach her a lesson. After dinner, I was back in my room and sat down at my table. I had never been so studious at any time in my life. I took out some composition books. I noticed on a corner of my table a small paper packet. I found enclosed in it a few coins. On the paper was written in her handwriting.
Time, piece 12 annas. Old paper 1 rupaya. Total 1 rupee and 12 annas.
I felt furious at the sight of it. I took the coins and went over to her room. The light was out there. I stood in the doorway and muttered, who cares for this money? I can do without it. I flung it on her bed and returned to my room. Later, as I sat in my room working, I heard the silent night punctuated by sobs. I went to her room and saw her lying with her face to the wall, sobbing. I was completely shaken. I didn't bargain for this. I watched her silently for a moment, and collected myself sufficiently to say, what is the use of crying, after committing a serious blunder? Through her sobs, she sputtered, what do you care, what use is it or not?
If I had known you cared more for a dilapidated clock. She didn't finish her sentence, but broke down and wept bitterly. I was baffled. I was in an anguish myself. I wanted to take her in my arms and comfort her. But there was a most forbidding pride within me. I merely said, if you are going to talk and behave like a normal human being, I can talk to you. I can't stand all this nonsense. You go away to your room. Why do you come and abuse me at midnight? She said. Stop crying, otherwise people will think a couple of lunatics are living in this house.
I went back to my room a very determined man. I lay on a mat, trying to sleep, and spent a miserable and sleepless night. We treated each other like strangers for the next 48 hours, all aloof and bitter. The child looked on this with puzzlement, but made it up by attending to her toys and going to the old lady for company. It was becoming a torture. I could stand no more of it. I had hoped Sushila would try to make it up, and that I could immediately accept it. But she confined herself to her room and minded her business with great concentration and never took notice of me. I caught a glimpse of her face occasionally and found that her eyes were swollen. I felt a great pity for her when I saw her slender neck as she was going away from the bathroom.
I blamed myself for being such a savage. But I couldn't approach her. The child would not help us either. She was too absorbed in her own activities. It came to a point when I simply could not stand any more of it. So the moment I returned home from college next evening, I said to her, going to her room, "Let us go to a picture." "What picture?" she asked.
Tarzan at Variety Hall. You will like it very much. Baby? The old lady will look after her. We shall be back at 9. Dress up. I was about to say, look sharp, but I checked myself and said, there is a lot of time. You needn't hustle yourself.
No, I'll be ready in 10 minutes, she said, rising. By the time we were coming out of the Variety Hall that night, we were in such agreement and showed such tender concern for each other's views and feelings that we both wondered how we could have treated each other so cruelly. I thought we might buy a new clock. That's why I gave away the old one, she said. You did the best thing possible, I said. Even in the hostel, that wretched clock worried everyone near about. I am glad you have rid me of it.
They make such beautiful ones nowadays, she said. Yes, right. We will go out and buy one tomorrow evening, I said. When we reached home, we decided that we should avoid quarreling with each other since, as she put it, they say such quarrels affect a child's health.